Did you know that vampirism and vampires exist within Starfinder? Among all the aliens, otherworldly beings, diseases, yes, vampires exist within Starfinder. I'm going to talk briefly about vampirism, how it works, the type of vampires that you could potentially run into, and although there are no rules to play as a vampire in Starfinder, we can explore how one might go about doing this. So what are vampires when it comes to Starfinder? They are considered to be undead creature types, which is unsurprising. They do feed on the blood of the living. Depending on where you've come from, there are several types of vampire that you could be. There's different planets that they could come from, many different creatures. They can succumb to the disease of vampirism. Now, your garden variety of vampire, they are known as Moroi. They can actually be found in the Pact Worlds as well as Near Space and the Vast. It is possible for a vampire to blend into mortal society and even hide their affliction. Now, depending on the type of vampire you are or who turned you, your weaknesses will vary, but many of the common weaknesses are well documented. Vampires cannot go out during the day. The natural light from the sun, it burns and destroys them. And vampires do have their mortal minions to go out during the day to go run their errands and do their general upkeeps, and during the night is when they will actually become more active. Now, with interstellar travel added to your mix for your vampire, it's easy to see how they would escape into space. This has allowed vampires to flourish in some areas because they can avoid the harsh light of the sun. They can escape into the dark places in space, and they can specially design massive ships to live on if they just wanted to drift into space. In Starfinder, vampires still have some of the classic aversions or the classic weaknesses that we're familiar with. Vampires cannot cross running water unless they are in the safety of their coffin. Vampires cannot enter a dwelling without first being invited. But there's also a new weakness when it comes to Starfinder, and that is a vampire cannot enter the drift without being in the protection of its coffin first. Now, a vampire's coffin can take many different shapes. It can be the classic wooden box that we're all familiar with. It could be a cryo chamber, and it is also possible within this new generation for vampires that these coffins are wired up so that the vampire can control the ship within the safety of its box. If we're talking about a vampire's personal spacecraft, you're likely dealing with a smaller ship, so you're going to have just the one coffin cockpit. It would likely have no windows, and as I mentioned, you're going to have either no light or you're going to have that non-UV light so that if they have a guest or a visitor on board, they can at least feel a little bit welcome without having to, burn to death in the light. Now, with the introduction of interstellar travel, the vampire has evolved beyond its common associations of just bats and wolves and things of the night. Being that each planet has different life, they have different animals that are active during the night scene. So the association to nocturnal creatures or to nocturnal plants is different depending on where you go and depending on how long the vampire has been there. Now, there are several different types of vampires in Starfinder. I'm going to talk about 4 of them. The first is going to be the Jiangshi. These are known as the hopping vampires. They get this name because that's how they move around. They do it by hopping, but they're a little different in the sense that they consume life essence from their victim, but they do it through consuming their breath. This is how they feed on the life energy of their victims. The Jiangshis, they also don't smell very good because they are literally just a rotting corpse. The way you create a Jiangshi or get a Jiangshi is when the soul does not depart the body. The body is still dead and decaying. The Jiangshi's appearance will also depend on the circumstances of its death. It can also take a very long time for this to happen. You're talking decades or centuries in some cases. Because of this and the circumstances around the Jiangshi's death, you will find that when one has arisen, it will usually still be in clothes or gear of some sort, but it will be horribly outdated. At least for those who are in the fashion know-how. If you are turned by a Jiangshi, or any creature that is turned by a Jiangshi will inherit the same weakness that comes from this breed of vampire. They do not like to be around cooked rice. They also don't like mirrors and the sound of bells, like hand bells. If a vampire of this type sees these things, it will stay at least 5 feet away from its source of revulsion. Now, the garden variety Moroi, they are more traditional in the sense that they consume the blood of other living creatures to sustain themselves. As a matter of fact, when you say the word vampire, most people will associate this to a Moroi. As I mentioned, the Moroi, they use servants to associate their tasks or complete their tasks during the day, things that help sustain and keep the vampire alive. These servants will be in the service of the Moroi for various reasons. Some want immortality, some want power, some want protection from the vampire. Some even one day hope to be turned into a vampire at some point. The weakness for a Moroi is garlic and a religious symbol for a non-evil deity. Same thing goes here. If they see one of those things, they must remain 5 feet away from the object of their revulsion. And if they stay in sunlight for 2 rounds, which would equate to about 12 seconds, they are destroyed. Now, there's also another weakness that comes with vampires that I didn't mention earlier. This is the fact that a vampire is not killed with a stake to the heart, it just renders them completely immobile and useless. Even if they are inside their protective coffin, they don't get their fast healing, their regenerative abilities, as long as a stake is in their heart. As soon as this is removed, they can start being healed again. You could also go with the holy anointed water route, so if you sever the head of a vampire with a stake in its heart, and anoint the head with holy water, then that vampire will be destroyed. We also have Void Shard vampires. These are vampires that were created in the presence of a different creature. These creatures, these Skidnuinars, it's another notoriously difficult name for me to pronounce. Skidnuinars, and these can be found in the Whispers of the Eclipse adventure book. These creatures, they don't like undead. However, they do allow the vampires to exist. They believe that they are going to destroy more undead creatures. This is why they allow them to live. And although they are integral to their creation, they do not have control over a Void Shard vampire. These particular vampires, they resemble more like gargoyles. They have more animalistic features, wings, big ears, giant claws. These vampires, while they like to be alone, they don't want to be completely alone. There's also the fact that they need living beings to sustain them. Because these are creatures of negative energy, you will usually find them clustering around tears in reality. They generally want to go to the negative plane. These particular vampires are weak to order. They despise anything that is precise, neat, and laid out. If they see something like this, they will be forced or compelled to destroy this thing that creates order, a wall in a straight line, neatly filed desks. They become so focused on destroying this order that they can think of nothing else. And one of the more powerful vampires that you can run into is known as the Nosferatu. They appear humanoid, except they are much taller, physically stronger, they have wings, and their claws are very, very long. They're also hairless, so there's another giveaway. A Nosferatu is not something that is created overnight. They are vampires who have lived for an incredibly long time. They have watched civilizations rise and fall. Many Nosferatu existed pre-Gap, and they will also have lost their memories of that period in time, but generally, a Nosferatu, although powerful, just wants to be left alone. They want to live their life. And just like the Moroi, the Nosferatu is held at bay by a holy religious symbol, the markings of a non-evil god, as well as garlic. Now, if I was going to let somebody be a vampire in my games, here's how I would go about it. Before I can get into that, though, we have to talk about the disease track. The disease track has 8 levels on it, the 8th level being death. The way this is supposed to work is if your character is infected with a disease or has some kind of injury with a contagion in it, you follow the disease track. Now, there's a physical and a mental one, but they function basically the same. Every day you make a specific check. Sometimes it's fortitude, sometimes it's will, sometimes it's something else. It really depends on the nature of the disease. Depending on the disease, you will have to do checks either once a day or sometimes faster if it's a particularly bad or potent disease. What I would do is I would treat vampirism as a disease following the physical disease track. Once a day, you would make a fortitude save, the difficulty of which dependent on how strong the vampire was that bit you, and every day you would progress down the track, provided you failed the save, with the last result being death. And when I mean death, that's when you actually turn into a vampire. In the Pathfinder system, if you are turned into a vampire, your character is dead and it becomes an NPC under the GM's control. And it works a little differently in the Pathfinder system because you have to have 2 or 3 feedings from your vampire before your character is dead or turned. When I was looking at this, there wasn't really anything in the Starfinder system to allow players to play as a vampire, but this is what I would do to allow it. Whatever vampire has turned your character, they will inherit the weakness. They will also get the abilities of that vampire type as well, but I wouldn't give them any ability boosts. Your character is just the same. It's the way it is. You would have all of the regular vampire weaknesses along with the specific weakness for the vampire who's turned you. I might look at doing some negatives around charisma or being in person because you're still off-putting. You look weird to other people. The other thing to mention with vampires is healing does damage. So you would have to do negative healing to get positive results when you are turned into a vampire. There is a spell in Starfinder called Necromantic Revitalization, so if you are a spellcaster or had a spellcaster, this would be a must for you. But vampires also gain some pretty powerful immunities. They are immune to death effects. They are immune to disease effects, paralysis, sleep, poison. So it's not like there's just drawbacks for being a vampire. If you want to see a little bit more about the monsters of Starfinder, my favorite is on the screen for you now. Stay tuned for more monster videos around Starfinder. Thank you to all of my patrons who support me and the channel. Tell me in the comments below what you would do differently if you were going to allow a player to be a vampire at your table. My name's Nathaniel. Thanks for stopping by, everyone.